January 1944, Eastern France, before dawn. The air is wet and heavy with frost. Snow clings to hedgerows and frozen fields. American boots press into the ground, leaving dark prints that harden almost immediately. Breath rises in short white clouds. Rifles feel heavier than they should. Steel burns through gloves. Somewhere ahead, German positions sit quiet, dug in, confident, maps folded, timetables memorized. For months, German officers had studied American units and wrote the same words in reports. Loud, undisciplined, unprepared for sustained combat, useful only in daylight, likely to break under pressure. The men moving forward do not know those reports exist. They know only the cold, the weight, the slow order to advance. Artillery rumbles far behind them, steady and deliberate, not dramatic, not rushed, just constant. This moment matters because it sits at the edge of a belief that will soon collapse, not from speeches or declarations, but from hours of pressure that do not stop, from infantry that keeps moving when doctrine says it should pause, from supply lines that keep feeding men and ammunition forward even as the ground freezes. By morning, something long held by the German command will be gone. By the winter of 1943, the war had shifted into a phase that German planners had never intended to face. The Eastern Front was bleeding the Wehrmacht dry. Italy had fallen out of the Axis camp. Allied bombers crossed the Reich daily, stripping cities, rail yards, and factories of protection. Yet in German field headquarters across France and the Low Countries, one belief still held firm. If the Americans came in force, they would come slowly. They would rely on machines. They would falter under sustained pressure. This belief did not emerge from arrogance alone. It was built from observation. In North Africa, German commanders had watched early American units struggle at Kasserine Pass in February 1943. Reports described poor coordination, rigid command structures, and units that withdrew too quickly when flanked. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel himself noted that American soldiers were brave but inexperienced, dependent on overwhelming firepower, and vulnerable when isolated. Those assessments spread quickly through German intelligence channels and hardened into doctrine. What those reports did not capture was how quickly the United States adapted. By late 1943, the American Army in Europe was no longer the force that had landed in Algeria. Training cycles shortened. Officer selection grew harsher. Combined arms coordination improved month by month. Infantry units learned to operate without constant armored support. Artillery doctrine shifted toward flexibility and speed rather than fixed barrages. Most important of all, logistics scaled to a level no European power had ever achieved. Behind the front lines, an unseen war unfolded. American ports in Britain unloaded millions of tons of material. Trucks rolled day and night. Ammunition dumps expanded until they resembled industrial districts. Field kitchens followed divisions closely, feeding men hot meals even in frozen fields. This was not excess. It was intention. The American command believed endurance decided modern war. German planners noticed the material flow but misunderstood its meaning. They saw abundance as softness. They believed soldiers cushioned by supply would lack resilience. They believed men who ate well would not fight hard when conditions turned brutal. This assumption rested on older European ideas about hardship-forging discipline. By early 1944, those assumptions shaped German defensive planning in France. Fortifications were built to delay, not to hold indefinitely. Counterattacks were scheduled on paper, timed to exploit what German officers believed would be American hesitation. The expectation was clear. The Americans would hit hard, then pause. They always paused. The winter fighting in places like the Vosges Mountains began to quietly dismantle that belief. There, American divisions fought not with speed, but with persistence. They attacked in weather German commanders thought would halt them. They returned after repulse without waiting days to reorganize. Each engagement was small in isolation. Together, they formed a pattern that German intelligence struggled to explain. By January 1944, reports from the front grew uneasy. American units were not withdrawing when expected. Supply convoys did not thin out in bad weather. Artillery fire did not slacken at night. Something fundamental had changed, and German command staffs were beginning to sense it. The change became impossible to ignore as the winter deepened. Along the Western Front, German divisions were holding long stretches of terrain with reduced manpower. Veteran units had been pulled east. Replacements arrived younger, less trained, and with fewer heavy weapons. The strategy depended on the assumption that time remained on Germany's side in the West. Delay the Allies. Bleed them. Force political hesitation. American commanders approached the situation differently. They did not measure success by ground taken in kilometers. They measured it by pressure maintained. Every advance, no matter how limited, forced German units to respond. Every response consumed ammunition, fuel, and manpower Germany could not replace. This difference in philosophy shaped daily combat. American infantry attacked strong points repeatedly, not because each assault promised a breakthrough, but because repetition itself exhausted defenders. Artillery units fired planned barrages with mathematical regularity. When one battery ran low, another took its place. Fire never fully stopped. To German soldiers, it felt mechanical, impersonal, and endless. Captured German reports from late 1943 and early 1944 reveal growing confusion. Officers noted that American units did not behave like traditional European armies. They attacked in poor visibility. They advanced at night with minimal pause. They brought forward food and ammunition even when roads were barely passable. One German regimental diary recorded that American troops appeared less concerned with losses than with maintaining momentum, a misinterpretation that masked a deeper truth. American doctrine emphasized replacement and rotation. Units could afford to continue because they were not meant to break. This system relied on one constant: supply. Food, in particular, became a quiet symbol of American warfare. Field kitchens followed close behind the front. Hot coffee arrived in insulated containers. Rations were issued reliably. Chocolate, canned meat, bread, small things, repeated daily. For German soldiers surviving on reduced rations and irregular deliveries, these details mattered more than speeches or propaganda. Morale shifted slowly. German infantry had been trained to endure hardship, but endurance without relief eroded cohesion. American soldiers, by contrast, experienced hardship with the expectation of support. That expectation created confidence. Men moved forward knowing the system would not abandon them. By the time planning began for the coming Allied offensives, German intelligence assessments were outdated. They still described Americans as tactically inferior, but materially overwhelming. What they missed was how the two had fused. Firepower and persistence were no longer separate. They reinforced each other. As winter fighting ground on, the front did not explode. It thinned. German lines grew brittle. Positions held on maps no longer matched reality on the ground. Small withdrawals became frequent. Reserves arrived too late or not at all. The stage was set for a collapse that would appear sudden but had been building for months. The first angle is human endurance, measured not by heroism but by routine. American infantry units in the winter of 1943 and early 1944 fought a war of repetition. Patrols, attacks, digging, eating, sleeping, then repeating it again the next day. There was little drama in it, no sweeping maneuvers, just sustained pressure applied by men who expected the system behind them to keep working. Letters and after-action reports describe exhaustion, frostbite, and fear, but they also describe predictability. Meals arrived. Ammunition arrived. Wounded men were evacuated. Replacements appeared. This reliability shaped behavior. Soldiers kept moving because experience taught them that stopping achieved nothing. The second angle is tactical adaptation. German doctrine emphasized decisive engagements, breakthroughs, encirclements. American doctrine by this stage emphasized attrition through contact. Infantry fixed the enemy. Artillery destroyed positions. Engineers opened routes. Armor exploited weakness when it appeared. This method frustrated German commanders. There was no single point to counterattack. Pressure came from many directions, often with no obvious main effort. Reports from German Corps commanders complained of unceasing small attacks that prevented rest and reorganization. The third angle is leadership at the middle level. American company and battalion officers were granted more autonomy than their German counterparts by late war necessity. When communication failed, American units continued based on intent rather than orders. German units, bound to tighter command structures and increasingly disrupted communications, often waited. Those pauses accumulated. Small delays became gaps. The fourth angle is the enemy perspective. German soldiers expected Americans to withdraw after setbacks. Instead, they returned, often the same day, often the next night. This behavior undermined confidence more than heavy losses. German field diaries record growing unease at the predictability of American pressure. It did not peak. It did not collapse. It simply continued. The fifth angle is symbolism. Food, not as luxury, but as certainty. Coffee steaming in the cold. Bread issued on time, rations that arrived even when shells fell nearby. For American soldiers, it meant continuity. For German soldiers watching from across the lines, it signaled something deeper, a system that did not falter under strain. These angles converged quietly. Together, they shaped the moment when German expectations finally failed. The sixth angle is psychological erosion. German defensive doctrine relied on the belief that an attacker eventually pauses. Men expect silence. They wait for it. American operations denied that pause. Even when no assault followed, artillery registration, patrol movement, and supply traffic created constant noise. Engines, boots, metal. The sound never fully stopped. German soldiers wrote of losing their sense of time. Night brought no relief. Sleep came in fragments. Fatigue accumulated faster than casualties. Another angle is logistics as a weapon. American supply lines functioned not as support, but as force multipliers. Trucks moved on fixed schedules. Engineers repaired roads under fire. Fuel, ammunition, and food moved forward regardless of weather. German intelligence recognized the volume, but misunderstood the effect. They assumed abundance softened soldiers. Instead, it hardened behavior. Units advanced because they trusted the system. That trust reduced hesitation, and hesitation was what German defenses depended on. There is also the angle of replacement. American divisions absorbed losses without visible collapse. Fresh troops arrived, units rotated, men disappeared and were replaced with unsettling speed. German soldiers began to describe American units as endless. Not brave in the traditional sense, not reckless, simply present again and again. This perception mattered. It eroded the belief that holding out could change the outcome. Another angle emerges in communications. American radio networks expanded rapidly. Redundancy replaced precision. Messages did not need to be perfect. They needed to arrive. German systems, strained by bombing and terrain, failed more often. Orders arrived late or not at all. When American units advanced without waiting, German units waited for instructions that never came. Finally, there is the moral angle. German soldiers had been told the Americans were fighting for money and comfort. What they saw instead were men advancing in cold forests and ruined villages with no immediate reward. No conquest, no land to claim, just movement forward. That contradiction forced a reevaluation. If comfort did not define American soldiers, then the assumptions built around them were wrong. All of these forces pressed together. None were dramatic alone. Combined, they set the conditions for a moment when resistance would fail not gradually, but suddenly. In late January 1944, the pressure reached a breaking point. The setting was not a famous beach or a named offensive etched into popular memory. It was a stretch of contested ground where German lines had been thinned to the minimum necessary to appear solid on maps. Snow-covered positions that had been reinforced months earlier but never intended to hold indefinitely. American artillery began the sequence without warning theatrics. Fire missions followed calculated patterns. Battery after battery rotated fire, so no single unit exhausted its stock. German forward observers attempted to adjust counter-battery fire, but communication lagged. Lines crackled. Messages arrived incomplete. By the time responses formed, American guns had already shifted. Infantry advanced behind this pressure not in waves, but in steady movement. Units probed. When resistance stiffened, they paused only long enough to redirect fire. Engineers cleared obstacles under cover of smoke and artillery. Supplies followed closely behind. Food trucks halted briefly, then moved again. Coffee was issued within range of enemy fire. This detail appeared repeatedly in German accounts, not because of envy, but because it defied expectation. Combat zones were supposed to be zones of deprivation. German commanders expected the advance to stall by nightfall. It did not. Attacks continued in darkness, guided by artillery illumination and practiced coordination. Positions that had held for weeks began to fail within hours. Not from a single blow, but from accumulated pressure that never allowed consolidation. By morning, withdrawals were no longer orderly. Units fell back to secondary lines that existed on paper but lacked cohesion in reality. Ammunition shortages became immediate. Rations failed to arrive. Orders conflicted. American units did not rush to exploit gaps in dramatic fashion. They simply kept moving forward, occupying ground that German doctrine assumed would be contested later. The collapse felt sudden because the final movement was fast. In truth, it was the result of months of erosion. German expectations of American hesitation failed in a single night. Lines that had been described as resilient dissolved before midday. This moment marked a shift not just in territory, but in belief. The assumption that American soldiers would break under sustained combat pressure no longer held. The second phase unfolded as German command attempted to restore order to something that no longer behaved like a line. Telephone wires were cut. Runners failed to return. Field radios competed with artillery interference. Commanders issued instructions based on maps that no longer matched the ground. American units were already past reference points that German officers still believed secure. At battalion and regimental levels, German officers faced a choice they had been trained to avoid: hold and risk encirclement, or withdraw without authorization and risk court-martial. Many chose neither. They delayed. That hesitation proved fatal. American pressure did not pause to allow decisions. It advanced into the uncertainty itself. Artillery remained the constant. American fire followed retreating units, not in pursuit, but in containment. Roads became unusable. Supply wagons burned. Horses broke loose. Vehicles clogged narrow routes. German formations compressed into smaller spaces where movement slowed and panic spread. Losses mounted not from decisive engagements, but from exposure. Infantry actions followed a pattern German defenders had not prepared for. Instead of pausing to reorganize after contact, American units adjusted on the move. Squad leaders redirected fire. Platoons shifted axes of advance without waiting for higher orders. The system encouraged motion. Even when resistance appeared strong, it was met with containment rather than assault, followed by movement elsewhere. German soldiers later described the experience as being pressed from all sides without seeing the hand doing the pressing. There was no single spearhead to counterattack, no obvious climax to prepare for, only a continuous forward presence that denied recovery. Food, again, marked the difference. American soldiers ate, not well by civilian standards, but reliably. Hot drinks appeared in the cold. Rations were distributed even during a movement. This steadiness mattered. It preserved strength. It preserved morale. It preserved the belief that the advance would continue because it always had. By the end of the second night, German resistance collapsed not through surrender, but through disintegration. Units separated. Leadership vanished. Cohesion broke. American reports described resistance as scattered and inconsistent. German reports ceased altogether. The line had not been smashed. It had been worn away until nothing remained to hold. The immediate aftermath did not look like victory. It looked like movement. American units advanced into ground that no longer resisted in organized form. Villages were entered cautiously. Roads were secured. Supply routes were extended. Engineers worked without pause. Bridges repaired. Mines cleared. The absence of coherent resistance was itself unsettling. Commanders had trained for counterattacks that never came. German losses were difficult to calculate because units ceased reporting as units. Prisoners arrived in small groups, exhausted, disoriented. Many had gone days without regular food. Interrogation reports noted confusion rather than defiance. Soldiers spoke of orders that never arrived and positions that could not be held. Several described the American advance as slow but unstoppable, a phrase that appeared repeatedly in captured documents. Strategically, the collapse forced German command to reconsider defensive planning in the West. Reserves intended for future counteroffensives were committed merely to stabilize the line. This weakened German flexibility ahead of larger Allied operations. The loss was not measured in territory alone. It was measured in belief. The assumption that American forces required pauses to regroup no longer applied. American casualty reports showed steady losses, but not catastrophic ones. Replacement systems functioned as designed. Units rotated. Fresh men arrived. The advance continued without interruption. This continuity mattered more than any single engagement. It signaled that the American war machine could sustain pressure indefinitely. Food again appears in reports. German soldiers noted American troops eating while advancing, drinking coffee near the front. This detail circulated widely among German ranks and reached rear units quickly. It became a symbol not of luxury, but of certainty. The Americans were not rushing toward a climax. They were settling in. Psychologically, this shifted the tone of the war in the West. German soldiers no longer spoke of holding until the Americans tired. They spoke of holding until something else happened. A miracle? A political shift? Anything external. The initiative had passed. The aftermath did not end the fighting. It reshaped it. From this point forward, German defenses would react rather than anticipate. The longer consequences emerged slowly, measured in reports rather than headlines. German High Command adjusted its language first. Assessments of American forces no longer emphasized inexperience. They emphasized scale and persistence. Field reports warned that American units could maintain offensive operations in conditions previously assumed to halt movement. Winter no longer guaranteed delay. Night no longer guaranteed pause. This shift affected planning at every level. Defensive depth increased, but manpower did not. Positions were stretched thinner. Commanders relied more heavily on fixed fortifications and less on maneuver. This reduced flexibility and increased vulnerability to sustained pressure. American doctrine exploited that weakness. Not with sudden thrusts, but with steady advance, supported by artillery and logistics. Captured correspondence reveals growing resignation. German officers wrote of fighting a force that did not seek decisive battles, but produced decisive outcomes through accumulation. Each lost village forced another withdrawal. Each withdrawal shortened supply reach. Each shortening weakened morale. The process fed itself. American forces continued to advance with the same pattern: pressure, adjustment, movement. Food distribution remained regular. Medical evacuation remained reliable. These systems did not remove fear or fatigue. They contained them. Soldiers expected hardship. They also expected support. That expectation shaped behavior at the front more than ideology or rhetoric. For German soldiers, the contrast became unavoidable. Their system demanded endurance without guarantee. The American system promised continuity, not comfort. Continuity. That difference altered perception at the individual level. Many prisoners stated they no longer believed the Americans would stop on their own. They would have to be stopped, and there were no longer enough resources to do so. By early spring 1944, the Western Front had changed character. It no longer waited. It absorbed. It bent. It receded. The collapse that followed major Allied offensives later that year did not begin on beaches or in breakout operations. It began in winter fields where assumptions failed quietly. The ground itself seemed to accept the advance. Roads opened, villages emptied, resistance fragmented. What had once been a line became a memory. The moment didn't announce itself with banners or speeches. It arrived quietly, carried forward by boots, engines, and supply trucks moving through cold ground. German soldiers had expected Americans to fight loudly, briefly, and then stop. What they encountered instead was something less dramatic and more decisive, a system that did not tire in the way men expected armies to tire. The recurring object was simple: food, coffee in metal containers, bread issued on time, warm calories moving forward as reliably as ammunition. It was not luxury, it was assurance. It told American soldiers that the line behind them was intact. It told German soldiers watching from broken positions that the enemy was not strained. That difference reshaped belief more powerfully than propaganda ever could. This experience changed how the German army understood the war, not because Americans were superior soldiers individually, but because they fought as part of a structure designed for continuity. Democracy expressed itself not in words, but in systems, in logistics that valued the individual enough to keep him fed, in command structures that trusted initiative, in an industrial base that sustained pressure without collapse. When German lines failed overnight, it was not a miracle or a sudden weakness. It was the end of an illusion, the illusion that abundance made men soft, the illusion that comfort erased endurance. What remained was a new reality, an army that advanced not toward glory, but toward inevitability. In the frozen fields of Europe, freedom did not arrive as an idea. It arrived as a process, one that kept moving,